Golden State Killer, the night of June 18th, 1976.
In Sacramento, California.
A woman inside her home hears a faint scraping sound at her sliding glass door. She freezes. The lock isn't broken, but the door is opening, inch by inch, on its own. A man in a ski mask steps inside, a flashlight blinding her eyes before she can see his face. He orders her not to move, not to scream, or he'll kill her. Then he ties her hands behind her back with shoelaces he brought with him, laces he had prepared in advance, tied into pre-made loops, ready to use. He tells her he's only there to get money. He tells her this is not personal. It is the sixth home he has broken into in this exact way in under a year. It will not be the last. For nearly 45 years, the man responsible for a string of home invasions, dozens of rapes, and at least 13 murders across California went by many names. The East Area Rapist, the Original Night Stalker, the Diamond Knot Killer, before true crime writers and investigators settled on the name that would define one of the most extensive manhunts in American history, the Golden State Killer. In the summer of 1976, Sacramento County was a patchwork of quiet, middle-class suburbs, the kind of place where people still left their sliding doors unlocked at night. That sense of safety unraveled quickly. Beginning that June, a series of break-ins swept through the Rancho Cordova area. The intruder's method was consistent almost to the point of ritual. He stalked his targets for days or weeks beforehand, learning their routines, sometimes entering homes while residents were out, just to study the floor plan. He preferred homes near open fields or green belts that offered an escape route. He struck almost exclusively when women were home alone or with children present, but no adult male. He would enter through an unlocked door or a window he had unlatched in advance. He carried pre-cut lengths of shoelace or cord, sometimes stolen from the victim's own home during an earlier, unnoticed visit. He bound his victims, ransacked the house for small, easily pocketed valuables, cash, jewelry, a class ring, and left with almost nothing else disturbed. Investigators noticed something else too. He called some victims afterward. Weeks or months later, a phone would ring, and a man's voice, heavy with breathing, would tell them he was still watching, that he wasn't finished. Then he'd hang up. By early 1977, what had started as a string of burglaries had turned unmistakably violent. The man investigators would soon call the East Area Rapist had struck at least 24 times, and detectives across Sacramento and Sacramento County agencies each realized they were chasing the same man, one who studied his victims before he ever crossed their threshold, and who seemed to know exactly how long he had before anyone would notice something was wrong. By mid-1977, the attacks had grown too frequent and too methodical to be the work of an opportunist. Detectives began compiling a profile. The man was likely in his 20s or 30s, physically fit, familiar with police procedure. He knew how to avoid leaving fingerprints, how to case a home without tripping an alarm, how to time his entries around patrol schedules. Some investigators suspected he had law enforcement or military training. It was a theory that would resurface again and again for decades. The attacks weren't isolated to one town anymore. Throughout 1977 and into 1978, the East Area Rapist expanded his range across the greater Sacramento region. Rancho Cordova, Carmichael, Citrus Heights, Stockton, Modesto, Davis. Each new jurisdiction meant a new police department, a new evidence file, and, critically, very little coordination between them. In an era before shared digital databases, a detective in one county had no easy way of knowing that a nearly identical crime had happened 40 miles away the week before. The attacker adapted his method as he went. He began targeting couples rather than women alone, a shift that seemed almost designed to heighten the terror and control of the act. He would separate them, bind the man face down, and stack dishes on his back, telling him that if he heard so much as a plate rattle, he'd kill the woman in the next room first. It was a detail that would appear with chilling consistency across cases separated by many miles and many months. Proof, eventually, that these were not coincidences, but the work of one man. By 1978, having committed at least 50 attacks, he seemed to vanish from the Sacramento area entirely. For nearly a year, there was silence. Detectives who had spent 2 years chasing him began to wonder if he had died, been arrested for an unrelated crime, or simply moved on. They were about to learn it was the third. In October 1979, more than 300 miles south in Goleta, California, a young couple was attacked in their home in a manner detectives in Santa Barbara County didn't immediately connect to the Sacramento cases. The victims survived, but 4 months later, in December 1979, another Goleta couple was murdered in their home, bound, then shot. Over the next several years, similar double murders occurred up and down the state. Ventura, Irvine, Dana Point, each involving a couple, each involving the same methodical binding, the same controlled invasion, and increasingly lethal violence. For years, these murders were attributed to a separate, unidentified assailant investigators called the original Night Stalker, with no confirmed connection to the East Area rapist case up north. It would take decades and the science of DNA to prove that the East Area rapist and the original Night Stalker, believed for years to be two different men, were, in fact, the same person. The final confirmed attack attributed to him took place in May 1986 in Irvine, the murder of 18-year-old Janelle Cruz. After that, the attack stopped entirely. No new confirmed assaults, no new murders, no letters, no calls. For more than 30 years, the man responsible for one of the largest known crime sprees in American history simply disappeared into ordinary life. The cold case that wouldn't die through the 1990s and 2000s. The case never fully went away, even as it went cold. Advances in forensic science allowed investigators to confirm, using DNA evidence, that the East Area rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same offender. A breakthrough that unified more than a decade of crimes under one unknown profile, now formally named the Golden State Killer by crime writer Michelle McNamara, who spent years investigating the case and pushing for renewed attention before her death in 2016. Investigators had DNA. What they didn't have was a name to match it to. Traditional law enforcement databases like CODIS require an existing criminal record to generate a match, and the Golden State Killer, whoever he was, had never been caught doing anything that would have put his DNA on file. By 2018, detectives turned to a method that had never before been used to crack a case of this scale: genetic genealogy. Investigators uploaded the killer's DNA profile to a public genealogy database, searching not for a direct match, but for distant relatives, third and fourth cousins, who had also submitted their DNA for ancestry research. From there, they built out an enormous family tree, cross-referencing age, location, and other known details about the suspect, gradually narrowing thousands of potential relatives down to a single family line, and eventually a single name. On April 24, 2018, investigators quietly collected a discarded item from the trash outside a home in Citrus Heights, the same suburban region where the very first attacks had occurred more than 40 years earlier. They tested the DNA on it. It matched. The man living in that house was 72 years old. He was a former police officer. His name was Joseph James DeAngelo. DeAngelo had served as a police officer in Exeter and later in Auburn, California, during the very years the East Area rapist attacks were happening, a detail that confirmed what investigators had suspected about their offender's background since the 1970s. He had been fired from the Auburn Police Department in 1979 after being caught shoplifting a can of dog repellent and a hammer, a minor offense that, in hindsight, a career that may have given him intimate knowledge of exactly how police departments operated, communicated, and failed to communicate with one another. For decades, DeAngelo had lived an unremarkable life a short distance from where his very first known crimes took place. Married, divorced, a grandfather, a retired truck mechanic, the kind of neighbor few would ever suspect. Neighbors described him as difficult and prone to angry outbursts, but nothing that pointed to the scale of what investigators now believed he had done. On April 24, 2018, police arrested DeAngelo outside his home. He was charged initially with 8 counts of murder, with additional charges, including kidnapping and rape, added as the investigation expanded across multiple counties because the statute of limitations had expired on most of the rape charges. By the time DNA evidence identified him, prosecutors were limited largely to the murder counts, though dozens of survivors were finally able to speak publicly about what had happened to them decades earlier. DeAngelo's case moved slowly through the courts, complicated by his age, the sheer scope of the charges against him. In June 2020, in a deal that spared him the death penalty, DeAngelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and admitted to numerous other uncharged rapes across the state, allowing survivors and victims' families to finally hear in his own words an acknowledgement of what he had done. At his sentencing hearing in August 2020, more than 40 survivors and family members were given the chance to speak directly to him, many for the first time, confronting in person the man who had haunted their lives since the 1970s and 80s. DeAngelo, seated in a wheelchair, offered a brief apology before being sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Golden State Killer case is unusual among cold cases in that nearly every open question who committed the crimes and where he'd been all along was ultimately answered. What remains less settled is how close investigators came to catching him decades earlier and how many additional victims might exist among cases never formally connected to his pattern. The case's true legacy may be procedural rather than personal. The genetic genealogy technique used to identify DeAngelo has since been applied to dozens of other previously unsolvable cold cases across the country, cracking open investigations that had sat untouched for decades. It also ignited an ongoing debate about genetic privacy, about how a distant relative's decision to spit into a tube for an ancestry kit could years later, and without their knowledge, help identify a family member as one of the most prolific offenders in American history. For more than 40 years, the man responsible for a decade of terror across California lived only a few miles from where it all began, mowing his lawn, working on cars, attending his grandchildren's birthdays, indistinguishable from anyone else on the street. It's a detail that more than any piece of forensic evidence may be what makes this case endure, not the mystery of who he was, but the unsettling reminder of how easily the person responsible can be the one no one ever thinks to suspect.